We've talked about the major different types of memory, semantic, episodic, and so on. And we've also talked about speech processing and a few other topics like attention. But there's a huge range of different specific cognitive tasks which our brains are capable of performing. Often these tasks involve complex combinations of perception, speech, and different types of memory. In the following sections, I'm going to look at how to understand the way brain anatomy and physiology carry out examples of some of these more specific tasks. By way of introduction, we've talked a lot about this high-level brain architecture. And the key point I want to remind you of now is that the really complex information processing is all performed by the cortex. Different areas in the cortex define and detect different receptive fields, and the detection of a receptive field has a very complex behavioral meaning. It's partially ambiguous because it recommends a wide range of different behaviors, each with a different individual recommendation weight. And there's significant information exchanges between cortical areas, and these exchanges can be viewed as implementations of selected behaviors. So the really complex information processes are performed by the cortex, and the various subcortical structures like the thalamus, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, the CA fields and dentate gyrus in the hippocampus proper and so on, they all get outputs from the cortex, interpret what those cortical outputs mean in behavioral terms, and return their conclusions back to the cortex. And in addition, the functions performed by the subcortical structures can be described in relatively simple cognitive terms. The basal ganglia determines and implements the behavior most strongly recommended by the cortex. The thalamus implements the selected behavior by releasing the cortical receptive field detections to appropriate targets. The hippocampal system interprets receptive field detections within cortical columns as recommendations in favor of various receptive field changes and determines which are most strongly recommended. The cerebellum records already learned sequences of behaviors and uses cortical information to execute them. So all these structures get cortical outputs, interpret them behaviorally, and in most cases act back on the cortex. So we can view cognition as sequences of cortical processes. We can label what the subcortical structures are doing, but we generally can understand how the cortical processes support cognition without getting into the details of the processes within the subcortical structures. So what I'm going to do is create this type of approximate higher level description for a number of cognitive tasks. This is the simplified cortical architecture we'll be using, and sometimes we'll use an even simpler architecture. It's got a number of cortical areas, and these areas detect receptive fields of different types. The challenge is to find sequences of processes in different cortical areas that can execute whatever cognitive task we're thinking about. One cortical receptive field detection carries a range of recommendation weights in favor of different behaviors. And for a behavior to be implemented, enough receptive fields with recommendation strengths in favor of that behavior have to be activated. But a cortical receptive field can only be activated under a limited range of circumstances. It can be directly detected within current sensory inputs, or it can be indirectly activated. But there has to be some justification for an indirect activation. And the only types of justifications available to the brain are different types of correlations between past activity of the inactive receptive field and past activity of other fields that are currently active. So the indirect activation of an inactive receptive field might be justified if it was recently active at the same time as some already active receptive fields, or if it was active on a number of occasions in the past at the same time as the currently active receptive fields, or if it was active during a period of receptive field expansion when the currently active receptive fields were also active. And of course, column recommendation weights can be made available a little longer by prolonging the activity of the column. In some cases, the past activity of the inactive column could be just before or just after the past activity of the currently active columns. To achieve these indirect activations, some receptive fields must record all the different types of temporal correlations in past activity. But remember that if, whenever a group of columns was active, any inactive column that had shown some kind of correlation in past activity with members of the group was automatically activated, the result would be chaos. So indirect activations have to be behaviors that are recommended by different receptive field detections that are currently being made, but only implemented if it's sufficiently recommended by a range of those currently active fields. And even direct detections can only occur if the sensory information is released into the appropriate cortical areas. And as we discussed earlier, these releases are attention behaviors that must be recommended by existing receptive field detections and accepted by the basal ganglia. In the case of recent activity, the receptive fields must only be recorded for a short while, perhaps of the order of minutes. In the case of activity prolongation, the receptive fields only last for the order of seconds. Now at this point, let me emphasize, as I have before, that these are the only mechanisms by which cortical recommendation strengths can be accessed. At anatomical levels, the brain can't use cognitive type information because neurons and columns don't have access to that type of information. They don't correspond with unambiguous cognitive categories, for example. However, there are some additional receptive field types that can be used because, again, they only need information readily available to neurons. One very important type is receptive fields that can discriminate between different relative degrees of activity in different populations of receptive field detections, sometimes in the same area, sometimes in different areas. And we discussed some applications of these types of receptive fields under semantic memory. So, to carry out a cognitive task, the brain has to start with some initial population of active receptive fields. And then the brain has to create a sequence of activations of other populations, each population recommending the activation of the next population in the sequence, but only using these types of mechanisms. And that has to go on until a population is reached with a predominant recommendation strength in favor of the behavior needed to complete the cognitive task. So, let me explain that again in a bit more detail using this cognitive architecture. In the monomodal visual areas, receptive fields are detected within inputs from the eyes, and these receptive fields can discriminate between different types of visual situations, visual objects, say, or groups of objects, or groups of groups, and so on. Then you've got auditory monomodal areas, and hearing speech drives appropriate activations through these areas. Then there's areas detecting more complex receptive fields, generally polymodal, getting information from more than one sense. And these receptive fields can discriminate between more complex types of cognitive situations. I've just illustrated one such area, but in the real brain there will be a number of such areas, detecting receptive fields with combinations of inputs from different combinations of monomodal areas. Then there are areas detecting even more complex receptive fields. These receptive fields may be defined by combinations of inputs from combinations of areas that could include both monomodal and other polymodal areas. Again, there'll be a number of areas of this type, but just one is illustrated. Some of these very complex areas detect receptive fields able to recommend very specific motor behaviors, like body movements in the case of the motor cortex, or eye movements in the case of the frontal eye fields. These are especially complex because they need to combine information recommending motor behaviors with information indicating the current position of the body. Some very complex receptor fields are also defined in the cortex-like amygdala. They discriminate between circumstances in which different general types of behaviors are appropriate. And of course, there may be a fair amount of genetic bias on the definition of these amygdala fields. Other areas have receptive fields that correspond with groups of columns in yet other areas that have frequently been active at similar times in the past, either at the same time or just before or just after. And for simplicity, all these types of receptive fields are illustrated as one area, although in the actual cortex there may be multiple areas of this type, detecting correlations in activity in different groups of other areas and targeting different areas. And recall that, as we discussed earlier in the course, this area is critical for semantic memory. But in fact, as I also pointed out earlier in the course, almost any receptive field in any area can actually be viewed as recording groups of columns with some kind of temporal correlation in their past activity. Although in the case of the monomodal areas in particular, you can put a partially ambiguous cognitive interpretation on the fields, the ability to discriminate between different types of circumstances. Another type of temporal correlation in the activity of a group of columns is recent activity at the same time, or just before, or just after, where recent means of the order of perhaps minutes. And again, there could be multiple areas with receptive fields of this type, and these areas are important for priming memory. Next, there are areas with receptive fields corresponding with groups of currently active columns, where current covers the time frame of a few seconds. And these areas can implement activity prolongation and are important for working memory. Then, this area has receptive fields that discriminate between different degrees of similarity between two active column populations in the same other area, how much overlap there is between the two populations in that other area. And again, earlier I described the role of this type of area in some semantic memory phenomena. In this area, receptive fields discriminate between relative degrees of activity in two different areas. In other words, discriminating between situations in which there's lots of activity in one area and little in a second area, and situations in which there's lots of activity in both areas. And I described how this area plays a role in some laboratory tests of procedural memory. This type of area has receptive fields corresponding with groups of columns in other areas that expanded their receptive fields at the same time. And this type of area is critical for recommending changes to receptive fields in other areas. In practice, there are three separate areas, the entorhinal, parahippocampal and perirhinal cortices, which are just simplified to one in this architecture. And this area is separated in this diagram, but as I discussed under episodic memory, it's really the same area as area 15, what I just discussed, but different populations of neurons in the area have slightly different receptive fields. In this area 14, receptive fields correspond with groups of columns in other areas that were active during the same receptive field expansion event, including columns that were active but didn't expand their receptive fields. So an indirect activation is implemented by column activity in one area, say the area discriminating between words, being released to another area where receptive fields are groups of columns in the first area that have been active at similar times in the past. Then the release of those receptive fields to yet another area to drive indirect activations. I'm going to use this architecture to illustrate how cognitive tasks are performed. And I use a type of semantic memory task that we've looked at a number of times as an example. But in fact, for simplicity, we can simplify further and just talk about an even more approximate description in which the activity in one area generates activity in another area on the basis of past temporal activity correlation and leave out the description of the intermediate area that's involved. But for this first cognitive task example, I'll use a more complete and complex description, then a simpler version for some of the later tasks. So this is the example I'm going to discuss first. The example is generating a response to seeing a picture of a dog and hearing the question, is that a dog? Which is a cognitive task we've talked about a number of times before. So I'll go through how that task could be performed. In the cortical architecture we've been describing, at the top, the sensory inputs are coming in, the auditory and the visual. The auditory inputs, in response to different words, will drive separate populations of active columns in the discriminates words area. The activity of the separate populations maintained at different phases of frequency modulation, and the different populations corresponding with different words. These separate populations are synchronized and released to the discriminates phrases area 5. There's simultaneous activity in columns in areas 4 and 5, and area 12 records groups of simultaneously active receptive fields in area 5 and targets those fields on active columns in area 4. The activation in area 5 also recommends a sequence of indirect activation and release behaviors which may be executed by the cerebellum. But it's a sequence that's been followed by rewards in the past, when it's been carried out in response to receptive field detections similar to those currently being detected in area 5. The first step in that sequence is to release activity in area 5 to area 13. Area 13, which defines receptive fields corresponding with groups of recently active fields in area 5. The activity in area 13 is released back to area 5, so activity in area 5 is prolonged in a loop, a working memory prolongation. So I'll leave the pale shading in area 13 to reflect that prolongation and go to the next step, which is release of area 5 activity to area 12, which records groups of columns recently active in area 5. Because of the earlier definition of receptive fields in area 12, those new receptive field detections can drive indirect activation of columns recently active in area 4 at the same time as the area 5 columns. So there's a reactivation of fields activated in response to hearing the word dog. The columns that were activated in response to the word dog then drive activation of columns in area 9, which have receptive fields corresponding with groups of area 4 columns that have often been active at the same time in the past. And the area 9 columns drive activation of columns in the visual objects area 1, the columns that have often been active in the past when the active area 9 columns were also active. That activation area 1 will correspond with a subjective experience of a vague dog image, a weighted average over many past experiences. The column activity corresponding with that vague dog image is prolonged by releasing the activity to area 13 and establishing short-term receptive fields that project back to the active columns in area 1 again. Next, direct visual inputs from the perception of the actual dog picture are processed through the early visual areas and generate a second population of active columns in area 1. The activity of this second population is prolonged at a different modulation phase from the first population by release of activity to area 13 and back again. Next, the outputs of the two populations in area 1 are synchronized and released to area 11. And this area 11 discriminates between different degrees of similarity in two populations of active columns in the same area. Now remember that one of the populations in area 1 corresponds with the indirectly activated dog image, and the other population corresponds with perception of an actual dog. So potentially there could be a significant overlap between the columns in the two populations, which is going to determine the part of the receptive fields that are detected in area 11. The receptive field detections in area 11 therefore correspond with significant similarity between the two active populations in area 1, and these detections in area 11 are released to area 8. Receptive field detections in area 5, which carry information about the question recently asked, are also released at the same time to area 8. Receptive fields in area 8 can discriminate between very complex circumstances, and they have speech recommendation strengths. And in this situation, the receptive fields detected within combinations of information derived from the question and information derived from the strong overlap between the two populations in area 1 have a predominant recommendation strength in favor of saying, yes, it's a dog. So what we've done is to describe an information processing route through this architecture to get from sensory inputs indicating the cognitive task to be performed to a verbal response that is an appropriate completion of the task, although it's of course possible that other routes may exist. The key point is that the only information that's available to neurons and columns is being utilized. In other words, information about past temporal correlations and activity and so on. So in the next sections, we'll use a similar approach to understand other cognitive tasks, sequences of activations of cortical information that only use information that's readily available to neurons and columns.